The air was thick with the acrid scent of burned fur and charred stone, the remnants of battle lingering in the cavern like the dying breath of a storm. Smoke curled in slow, spiraling tendrils from the blackened ground, weaving through the jagged edges of rock where fire had licked too hot, too long. Embers pulsed in the darkness, their soft glow the only illumination amid the destruction. Lucas stood in the center of it all, a lone figure amid the smoldering ruin. His breath was shallow, his posture unsteady, his shoulders rising and falling in heavy, uneven motions. His clothes were torn, singed at the edges, and his hands trembled slightly, as if the fire that had burned so fiercely around him had not yet fully faded from within. Wisps of heat still clung to his skin, the last echoes of the battle he had waged alone. The beast was dead. Its massive form lay crumpled against the cavern wall, half buried beneath the remains of what had once been a natural outcropping of rock. The stench of burned fur was overwhelming, mixing with the metallic tang of blood that had seeped into the stone beneath it. Its great limbs, once so fluid and terrifying in their deadly strength, were now still. Charred muscle and twisted sinew frozen in the throes of final agony. Its fanged maw hung open, lips pulled back in what could have been a final snarl, but its glowing eyes, once so piercing, so hungry, had faded to lifeless embers. Mina was the first to move. She darted forward, her boots skidding slightly on the scorched ground as she reached for Lucas, her hands finding his arms before he could stumble. "You're alive," she breathed, her voice tight with relief. Her grip was firm, grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. He exhaled sharply, blinking as if only now registering her presence. "I'm here," he murmured, though the words felt distant, disconnected. His head was still swimming, his vision flickering between the cavern around him and the battle that had raged mere minutes ago. The fire, the heat, the way the beast had lunged, relentless even as flames devoured it. He had pushed himself further than ever before, let the inferno rise unchecked, burning hotter than he thought possible. Now the weight of it pressed against his bones, a dull exhaustion seeping into his muscles. The others approached cautiously, their silhouettes cutting through the fading smoke. Thomas was the first to reach them, his expression dark as he took in the devastation. His sharp gaze swept over Lucas, his eyes narrowing. "You good?" he asked, though his tone held less concern and more unspoken questions. Lucas hesitated. He didn't know how to answer. He wasn't injured, at least not in any way that showed. But something was different. The fire had felt different. The way it responded to him, the way it surged without hesitation, without limit, it had felt right. That was what unsettled him the most. "I'm fine," he said finally, though Mina didn't let go of his arm. Thomas didn't look convinced, but he let it go, for now. Candace and Dyra arrived next, their eyes flicking between Lucas and the corpse of the beast. Dyra, who had once stood frozen in terror before this creature, now let out a slow breath, her fingers unconsciously tightening around the hilt of her dagger. "I can't believe you killed it," she murmured, half in awe, half in disbelief. "It had to be done," Candace said, her voice more measured, though there was an edge of unease in her tone as she looked between Lucas and the destruction he had wrought. "But this wasn't just a fight. It was a massacre." Lucas tensed at her words, something cold settling in his stomach. He had only been trying to survive, to make sure the beast didn't drag him into the depths of its lair and tear him apart. But looking around now, at the sheer devastation left in his wake, he wondered if he had gone too far. Aphyrosia had been silent until now. She approached the fallen beast slowly, her expression unreadable, her long cloak sweeping across the ashen floor. The air around her shifted subtly, as if responding to her presence, a quiet current of energy brushing against the ruins of the battle. She knelt beside the creature's massive form, placing a hand against what remained of its fur. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then finally she exhaled, fingers tracing faintly along the beast's blackened hide. "This was not a mindless predator," she said, her voice thoughtful, almost reverent. "It was a guardian." The words sent a ripple of unease through the group. Thomas frowned. "A guardian of what?" Aphyrosia did not immediately answer. She continued her examination, brushing away soot and ash to reveal something beneath, a faint, intricate pattern carved into the creature's thick hide, hidden beneath layers of fur. Symbols, old and barely visible, etched into its flesh like a brand. Candace inhaled sharply. That's Nithari script. The realization settled heavily over them. Lucas swallowed hard, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He had assumed the beast had been hunting them, that it was nothing more than a force of nature acting on instinct. But if it had been guarding something, if it had purpose, then what had he just destroyed? Mina shifted beside him, her expression tight as she looked between the markings and Lucas. He could feel the question forming in her mind before she even voiced it. What did we just awaken? Aphyrosia's gaze lifted to meet Lucas's, sharp and knowing. Whatever this place is, whatever it was protecting, it is not just a lair. And you, Lucas, you were drawn here for a reason. Lucas clenched his jaw, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. He didn't want to believe in fate. He didn't want to believe that every step he took, every battle he fought, was already written for him in some ancient, unseen script. But as he stood there, surrounded by fire and ruin, the beast's lifeless body at his feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a threshold he couldn't return from. And whatever lay ahead, it was watching. The cavern was silent, except for the occasional drip of water from the ceiling, hissing when it met the still warm embers scattered across the floor. The oppressive weight of the battle lingered in the air, thick as smoke, as if the cavern itself still held its breath in the aftermath. Lucas exhaled slowly, his muscles stiff as the fire in his veins finally receded to a dull warmth. The exhaustion in his limbs was undeniable, but something gnawed at the back of his mind. Something more than fatigue. A sense of unfinished purpose. They weren't alone in this cavern. Not anymore. Mina helped steady him, her fingers lingering on his wrist for a moment longer than necessary before she pulled away. You good? She murmured, her voice quiet but firm. Lucas nodded mutely, his gaze drifting past her toward the beast's ruined corpse. The moment he looked at it, a pulse of unease rippled through his core. There was something unnatural about how the body lay, its twisted form half buried beneath rubble, its great claws still curled as if in the middle of a defensive swipe. Even in death, the creature radiated something more than mere animalistic rage. It had been protecting something. Candace was the first to move. She stepped over scattered debris, her sharp eyes sweeping the cavern. We need to see what's down here, she said. If the beast was a guardian, there's a reason it stayed in this place. Thomas grunted in agreement, adjusting his stance as he scanned the cavern's far reaches. Let's find out what it was protecting. As the group began searching through the wreckage, they uncovered the grim remnants of past victims, scattered bones, rusted weapons, and torn remnants of cloth, long degraded by time. The discovery set a weight over them, a quiet acknowledgement of those who had fallen before them. But beneath the layers of ash, stone, and decay, something else emerged. Candace let out a sharp breath as she brushed away debris from an object partially buried beneath a mound of charred remains. She pulled it free, a long, darkened metal plate adorned with faded carvings. As she wiped at the soot, faint symbols glowed softly beneath her touch, their shapes unmistakable. Nithari script, she murmured. Aphyrosia turned toward her, her expression shifting into something unreadable. Are you certain? Candace nodded, flipping the metal plate in her hands. This isn't just a burial ground. This place, it's connected to something much older than the beast itself. As if to confirm her words, Dyra let out a quiet gasp. She had been rifling through the remains of what appeared to be an old satchel, its leather brittle and flaking. But inside, beneath layers of dust and time-worn cloth, something gleamed, a jagged crystal shard, encased in a strange metallic frame. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The shard pulsed faintly, as if something within it was still alive. A thick, shifting fluid moved inside, swirling like liquid silver trapped in glass. The moment Lucas's eyes landed on it, his breath caught. There was something inside that crystal. Something alive. Lucas felt it before he even stepped closer, a presence, sharp and hateful, like a blade pressed against his mind. It radiated an intense loathing, a weight so oppressive that he instinctively recoiled. The sensation wasn't just anger. It was pure, undiluted hatred. He clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. The presence in the shard wasn't just malevolent. It was intimidating. Like a voice screaming without sound, trapped in a prison of glass and metal. Mina noticed his reaction immediately. Lucas? He didn't answer. He couldn't. The longer he stared at the shard, the more it pushed back, as if aware of his presence. It lashed against his senses, thrashing like a caged beast, its rage coiling tight against the edges of his mind. Lucas, step back, Aphyrosia warned, her voice calm but firm. He exhaled through his nose, tearing his gaze away, but the sensation lingered. What the hell is that? Thomas asked, his tone wary. Candace hesitated before speaking. I don't know, but I think it's tied to the prophecy. Lucas closed his eyes for a brief moment, focusing on breathing, on pushing back against the lingering imprint the crystal had left on him. When he spoke, his voice was lower, strained. There's a soul in there, he said. The words sent a shiver through the group. Aphyrosia studied the shard with a quiet intensity. Not just a soul, she murmured. A soul that was meant to be bound. Dira swallowed hard, gripping the satchel as if holding it too loosely might let something escape. You mean, like a prison? Aphyrosia didn't respond immediately, but her silence was answer enough. Mina exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. Then why was the beast guarding it? It was a question none of them could answer. Candace examined the metallic frame surrounding the shard. This isn't normal craftsmanship, she said. It's too precise, almost arcane. Lucas forced himself to look at it again, though the weight of the entity within still pressed at the edge of his mind. It's not just a relic, he muttered. It's something dangerous. Aphyrosia gave a slow nod, and we must decide what to do with it. The thought settled over them like a storm cloud. What did they do with something like this? Destroy it? Bury it? Or worse, use it? Lucas felt Mina's gaze on him, watching him carefully. She understood what this meant, what it could mean for him, for all of them. After a long silence, Candace straightened, slipping the shard back into its leather wrapping with careful hands. We'll figure it out, she said, though the certainty in her voice didn't quite reach her eyes. Lucas wasn't sure if it was a promise or a warning. One thing was clear. Whatever had been buried in this lair, whatever the beast had been protecting, was never meant to be found. The mountain wind howled against their backs as they trudged up the icy path, their bodies worn from battle, their minds heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. The discovery of the crystal shard, the rage-filled soul trapped within, the grim realization that the beast had not simply been a predator but a guardian, all of it lingered in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Lucas felt every step in his bones. His body was still weak, drained from the fight, his fire dimmed to embers within him. Mina remained close by, steadying him when his legs wavered, though she never said a word about it. She didn't have to. The bond between them hummed in the background, a constant, silent reassurance. Candace led the way, her sharp eyes sweeping the terrain ahead. The mountain paths had grown more treacherous, as if the land itself had shifted in their absence. The storm had passed, leaving behind thick layers of ice and fresh cracks in the rock, subtle but telling signs that the watcher had moved. Aphyrosia followed behind, quiet and thoughtful. The Queen of the Elves rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but Lucas could feel the intensity of her presence like a low thrumming beneath his skin. She, too, had sensed something off since they had left the lair. Then there was Thomas, ever watchful, ever steady. He had carried more of their burden than most, his silence often heavy with unspoken thoughts. Dira, for her part, had barely spoken since they left. She kept to the middle of the group, glancing over her shoulder now and then, as if expecting the shadows of the mountain to watch her back. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. Something was wrong. The entrance to Ceylan's cave was just as they had left it, or so it seemed at first. The jagged stone arch loomed before them, half covered in snow, the winds whistling low through its narrow mouth. But the moment Candace stepped forward, she stopped short. "This isn't right," she muttered. Lucas frowned, following her gaze. It looked the same, but it wasn't. The air was too still, too thick. The moment they crossed into the mouth of the cave, the familiar damp cold that had clung to the walls before was gone, replaced by something warmer, heavier. The cavern's natural roughness had been smoothed over, the walls seeming less jagged, less natural. "This place has changed," Aphyrosia said quietly. Thomas set his jaw. "Changed how?" Aphyrosia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow step forward, one hand lifting as if feeling the air itself. "The energy here is layered," she finally murmured. "Something has been rewritten." Lucas exhaled, steadying himself against the rock wall. He could feel it too, the hum, the vibration beneath his feet. It wasn't just the cave that had changed. It was as if time itself had shifted within these walls, folding in on itself in a way that made no sense. Dira shuddered. Where's Ceylan? No one had an answer. The fire pit where the old man had once sat, where he had mumbled cryptic riddles about cycles and fate, about sleeping names and watching tombs, was empty. There was no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been here. Mina walked deeper in, her gaze sharp, wary. "There's something else," she said. They followed her line of sight, and froze. At the far end of the cavern, where only rough stone should have been, something impossible stood. A door. A massive mahogany door, towering over them, its dark wood gleaming as if untouched by time. It shouldn't be there. It couldn't be there. And yet it was. Thomas took a step closer, his breath slow and measured. That wasn't here before. Candace's fingers curled into fists. No, it wasn't. The door was massive, easily 10 feet tall, its surface smooth but adorned with intricate carvings, swirling patterns of eyes, spirals, and figures locked in unknown poses. It was beautiful but unnerving, the kind of craftsmanship that felt ancient, purposeful. 2 ornate brass knockers jutted out from its surface, gleaming despite the dim light, shaped like watchful faces, their eyes hollow but somehow aware. Lucas swallowed. He could feel it, something behind the door. Watching, waiting. Mina's voice was quiet. Ceylan's gone. It was a statement, not a question. Aphyrosia exhaled through her nose, unreadable, or he was never meant to remain. Dira took an instinctive step back. So what does that mean? He vanished? Just like that? No one could answer her. Candace took a slow breath, composing herself. The Watcher moves with time. Ceylan said it himself. Maybe this place isn't ours anymore. The thought settled heavily between them. Lucas barely heard the words. He was still staring at the door, because something behind it was stirring. Not physically, not audibly, but in the way a storm builds before it breaks. The hair on his arms rose, a slow prickling dread creeping up his spine. There was power behind that door. Power that should never have been disturbed. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet but firm. Lucas exhaled, rubbing his temples. His exhaustion was bone deep, his mind frayed, but he couldn't ignore the pull, the whisper of something ancient that had been waiting for them all along. The prophecy had led them here. The Watcher had moved. And now, this door stood in their path. There was no going back. Mina stepped beside him, her expression set. "We go forward." Candace nodded, her fingers flexing at her sides. "We came here for answers." Aphyrosia said nothing. She simply stepped forward, reaching out, her fingertips grazing the smooth surface of the mahogany door. The instant she touched it, a low resonance filled the cave. A soundless vibration that thrummed through the stone, through the air, through them. The door was opening itself. Lucas barely had time to react before the massive structure creaked, the hinges groaning like an ancient beast awakening from its slumber. The cavern's dim light bent inward, sucked into the growing abyss beyond the threshold. A deep warmth spilled from inside, unnatural in contrast to the freezing mountain air. And then the door swung open completely, revealing a world that should not have been possible. A grand hall, bathed in soft golden light. A mansion, untouched by the ruin of the outside world. And in its center, a long dining table, adorned with a feast fit for kings. The group stood frozen at the threshold, realization dawning. They had stepped into something far beyond themselves, and there was no turning back.